Hello and welcome to this lecture on Plato's Republic. This lecture is on Book 1. This is for Introduction to Philosophy. And I'm going to take you through the argument of Book 1 of the Republic in this lecture. And it's, as we'll see as we go through the book, Book 1 has a kind of curious status. It's kind of different to the rest of the book. Some people have speculated that it was tacked on and then the rest of the book was kind of written at a different time. Maybe Book 1 was earlier. But the interesting thing is it actually sets up the argument of the book very effectively, and a lot of the issues that come to the fore when we get into the argument of chapter 2 onwards, we'll see already prefigured in Book 1. So there's a lot of things to sort of think about and in fact to return to in Book 1, and here we also get the famous clash of Socrates and the sophist Thrasymachus that we have to work through as well, and that is, I think, fundamental. That clash is fundamental to the rest of the book as well, as we'll see. So we'll take a close look at that too. Okay, so people in the play, or people in the book in this case, the people here in Book 1, as we'll see again, they apart from Socrates, they don't play a prominent part in the rest of the book. Socrates has the major part in the book as a whole. That's consistent, but the other characters kind of don't really have major parts from this point forward. So Socrates, and in Bloom's translation, the translation that we're using, Socrates is the person that says I. So Socrates speaks in the first person. Everybody else has their sort of name registered, or it's sort of he said rather than I said. So Socrates is clearly the main protagonist in the book, as we'll see. And Socrates was the teacher of Plato, and we'll see with all of the characters in the book, Plato, these were sort of real living citizens of 5th century Athens. Most of them lived through the time of the democracy that we talked about in the introduction lecture, and these were people that would have been sort of well known among citizens of Athens. So Socrates was the philosopher, as we said, the teacher of Plato. Cephalus, who we meet, one of the first, is the son of Lysanias. He was actually a metic. So as we talked about last time, those were non-citizens in Athens, but they could also accumulate considerable wealth. As an elderly arms manufacturer, he was able to accumulate wealth, and we sort of hear about that in the book. Polemachus is the son of Cephalus, and Thrasymachus, the final character we meet in this chapter, he's a sophist who lived in Athens, and so there's a kind of big controversy between the philosophers and the sophists that was going on at this point, that we need to address and find out some of the kind of history and the reasons behind that antagonism that clearly comes out in Plato's Republic. And in fact, Plato sees the sophists as kind of philosophers gone bad. That's the message that comes through in the Republic, that sophists are kind of the twisted, bad form of philosophers. Maybe they could have been good, but they took this bad turn. And it ended up as sophists in this kind of cynical profession of taking money to give expert advice. So there's this kind of antagonism that we'll talk about. The person of Thrasymachus is presented in a very interesting way in the Republic, and there's a lot of kind of details that are interesting and important. So we'll look at Socrates' encounter with all of these citizens. And of course, like we said last time, we have to bear in mind as we work through this that Socrates is the character in this book. Plato actually writes the book But the task is to figure out what Plato is saying about Socrates, and what Plato is saying about philosophy. And there are times when we're going to need, when we do that, when we're going to need to think about who's really speaking. Is Plato speaking on his behalf? Is he putting words into Socrates' mouth and claiming that they're Socrates' words, or is he shaping Socrates' words in order to make some other point? So these are some of the questions and some of the problems of interpretation that are going to arise from the relation between Socrates and Plato that we're going to have to dig into as we work through. Okay, the very beginning of the book on page 3 in Bloom's translation is worth just taking a look at. This is right at the start, and the action begins at the Piraeus, the famous port of Athens that was still around today. It's a lot bigger today, but you can see in the ancient world at this time it was a famous port, and of course the Athenian navy was a sort of a very lauded part of the city's heritage after the Persian War. So here's where the action takes place. Let's just read through and see sort of why this beginning has some features that you might miss if you're reading it for the first time. So it begins with Socrates talking as follows. I went down to the Piraeus, that's the port, yesterday with Glaucon, son of Ariston. Glaucon, as we'll find out, is Plato's brother, and he's going to play a big part from book 2 onwards. So I went down to the Piraeus with Glaucon to pray to the goddess, and at the same time I wanted to observe how they would put on the festival, since they were now holding it for the first time. Now, in my opinion, the procession of the native inhabitants was fine, but the one the Thracians conducted was no less fitting a show. After we had prayed and looked on, we went off towards town. Catching sight of us from afar as we were pressing homewards, Polemachus, son of Cephalus, ordered his slave boy to run after us and order us to wait for him. The boy took hold of my cloak from behind and said, Polemachus orders you to wait. And I turned around and asked him where his master was. He is coming up behind, he said, just wait. Of course we'll wait, said Glaucon. A moment later, Polemachus came with Adymatus, who will also meet in book 2 as well. Glaucon's brother, Niceratus, son of Nicias, and some others, apparently from the procession. Polemachus said, Socrates, I guess you two are hurrying to get away to town. That's not a bad guess, I said. Well, he said, do you see how many of us there are? Of course. Well then, he said, either prove stronger than these men or stay here. Now, it's kind of, there's something a little curious because there's an implied threat here, right? There's a kind of coercion that's come in, that Socrates is being sort of asked in a very forceful manner to come back to Polemachus's house, and that's sort of registered in the either prove stronger than these men or stay here. So the issue here is power, right? And the issue of who's going to force Socrates, and there's an interesting point here made by Alan Bloom in the interpretive essay at the end of the book that this kind of mimics the idea of Plato's apology. And it mimics Plato's apology in the sense that Socrates is being held and being forcefully made to account for himself, and that's what the apology is. It's Socrates' account for himself before the Athenian jury, as Plato imagines it, or as Plato possibly imagines, remembers it, and Socrates' account of why he shouldn't be put to death. And this sort of setup suggests that the Republic is also Socrates being sort of fictionally arrested and taken back to Polemachus's house, where he's going to give an account of himself and give an account of philosophy. So it's like this is Socrates' real apology when he really gets the chance to make his case. Notice the kind of class structure here as well. You'll see Polemachus is kind of the kind of wealthy citizen, and he orders his slave boy to hold on to Socrates. And we'll see this order of these three classes reflected in Plato's Republic. The sort of philosopher who has to be forced to rule, the kind of gentleman, or the kind of person who looks out for the city. As we'll see, Polemachus has that kind of nationalist focus. And then there's the kind of craftsman class of people who do the work and make everything, are forced to make everything run. And there's a considerable slave population in Athens, as we talked about last time. So this theme of power and this theme of Socrates almost being arrested is very significant here, and it suggests that what's going on is Socrates is going to give an account of philosophy, an account that justifies philosophy's place in the Athenian city, and justifies philosophy against the charges that Socrates was a danger to the city, and that it was philosophy that posed a danger to the city and the democracy. Okay, so we go to the house of Polemachus and Cephalus as the sort of the father of Polemachus and the person who represents old age. And old age, of course, represents, it's more than old age, it's tradition, it's the passing down of tradition and ritual and custom to the younger generation. And that seems to be very much why Cephalus is here. And Cephalus basically sort of makes a number of points and gets the dialogue going, and then sort of leaves the dialogue so that a real discussion that is not sidetracked by discussion by duty and by things like tradition. Once tradition is out of the way, then the conversation can really get started. So Socrates asks Cephalus what old age is like, and Cephalus has this kind of interesting response where he says, when the desires cease to strain and finally relax, it is possible to be rid of very many mad masters. This again is deeply significant. Desire is going to play an really important role in Plato's setup of the city, and in particular, what we're going to see as important is the kind of confinement of desire. It's putting into its rightful place, which doesn't mean the extinguishing of desire, but it means it's amenable. It's amenable to reason, and it follows reason's lead, and it doesn't want to be in charge and make decisions. And Cephalus is kind of saying, well, that's what happens when you get old, that desire loses its sting, and finally you can be calm and relaxed and reasonable. And it's as though this happens without any kind of this happens in old age without any kind of training and effort and so on. But this is a central theme of desire, of how it's being in its rightful place, and it's being subservient to reason and our judgment is a really crucial thing, and a crucial part in our happiness and well-being. Not that desire is a bad thing, but desire has to be properly trained, properly habituated, and must be obedient to reason. Socrates is somewhat jokey response. Okay, but it helps that you're rich as well. I.e., it's not just about desire, right? The reason old age is not too much of a burden for you, Cephalus, is because with all your money from your arms business, you're a wealthy old man. All right, so this produces the significant twist in the dialogue where we shift onto what's going to be the main theme for the rest of the book. And Cephalus pivots to the discussion between wealth and justice. And he says that basically, yes, wealth is important, but wealth is important for for paying one's debts, right? In other words, if you borrow something from somebody, you can pay it back. If you make a promise to somebody, you can live up to that promise and give them what you promised them. So it allows you to pay your debts, pay off, clear your sort of balance, and make sure that you can go to the other place with a clear conscience. So the role of wealth and justice, Cephalus takes to be Cephalus takes to be basic, and note here the idea that Cephalus is sort of pushing here that justice is a matter of law. It's a matter of sort of paying debts, making sure sort of the balance is in equilibrium, right? You don't owe anything, you're not owed anything, and everything is in kind of equilibrium. It's like a legal definition of justice, right? When we've paid our debts, everything is good. Now, Socrates uses a simple, even we could say a simplistic example to poke a hole in this definition of justice, this relation of wealth and justice that Cephalus poses. But this example is sufficient for Socrates' purposes here. So let's see what happens. Socrates comes up with this idea of a friend borrowing a weapon, and he says, yes, Cephalus, but if a friend borrowed a weapon, if you promise to lend a friend a weapon, and then that friend goes mad, goes insane, and then comes asking for the weapon, right? In that case, you wouldn't lend it to them. And Cephalus says, yes, that's right, Socrates. I don't know what to say about this example, and then sort of leaves the room when his pass is finished. So what happens here is that Socrates pokes a hole in that legal definition of justice by saying, there's something underlying, there's something deeper about justice, and that requires us to know what's good for people, right? We can't just think about giving people their due in a legal sense, what we owe them. We also have to think about what's good for them, right? And whether, even if we owe a friend a weapon, if they've paid for it, right, do we still give that to them if legally we owe them? And Socrates is saying, no, there's this higher moral criterion of what's good for somebody, and those are judgments we make, and that outweighs this legal idea of justice, right? So what this does is it launches the discussion of justice, and it allows the kind of simple, traditional, ritual, and sort of legalistic view of Cephalus to be easily kind of sidelined. Cephalus has no response to this. He hasn't really thought deeper than the legalistic view of justice. So now the conversation can move forward. And now it's Polemachus' turn to come in and take up the conversation and take up the role of his father as sort of the person who's going to drive this definition forward. And Polemachus' definition is quite simple. He says justice is really about doing good to friends, and then when he's sort of pushed, he's talking about doing good to friends and harm to enemies. And what he's really talking about here is loyalty to family and loyalty to the city. So justice is essentially loyalty to your people, doing good for your people. And he mentions Simonides here in an appeal to authority, and says, look, this is Simonides' view, I'm just articulating it. That's an appeal to authority, right? When you say it's not my view, I'm just endorsing this view of this other person, right? So Socrates says, well, of course, I don't want to challenge the venerated author Simonides, so let's take a close look at this definition, right, and see what we can do with it. And it's a definition about, like I said, about loyalty, that justice is doing good to friends, harming enemies. It's doing good things to people that are loyal to you, and harm to people that are not your people. And it raises important themes relevant to justice, like friendship and community. What do we owe our own community that we don't owe people that are not part of our community? And justice and the common good. One thing Socrates raises in response is that, as we'll see, that that it can't be an idea of justice to do harm to enemies, because justice is about doing good, and it's a kind of art of doing good, right? So as a doctor, you're sort of trained in an art of doing good, and you don't sort of do wrong to people, insofar as you're a doctor. And justice is a similar thing that doesn't involve harm, but simply involves doing good. Essentially, Socrates' response to Polemachus is showing that a man who wishes to be just must be cosmopolitan, right? That's Bloom's word cosmopolitan, which means justice means you have to give up the idea of caring more about your citizens or your group than everybody else. If we care for the good, we should care for it wherever we find it. There can be no ethical priority for one's own family and people, right? So good. So first we have to know who is good, and we can't sort of know that by knowing who's loyal to us, right? So it might be that some people we don't consider loyal are also sort of follow the definition of good, right? Goodness is not marked by loyalty, it's marked by the things you do and the way you are. So if we care for the good, we should care for it wherever we find it, not just where we find it in our own family or people, but universally. This is going to be a major theme about the relation of justice to things that we personally care about that are our own, whether that be family, community, and our own city, and our own state, our own people, right? What's the relation of justice to those commitments? And Socrates here, Plato is putting into Socrates' mouth this argument that there's a sort of cosmopolitan aspect to it, that caring for one's own doesn't really live up to the standard of justice, and doesn't take care of the commitments of justice, which are in fact universal, and don't depend on things like loyalty. Okay, so after we've gone through this argument with Thrasymachus, with Polemachus, it's Thrasymachus next who takes up the argument. And it's interesting to see Thrasymachus' entry into the conversation. It's a very sort of forceful entry. It's a very dramatic entry, and I'm always reminded here that Plato, what we have with the Republic is a dramatic text. It's not a collection of philosophical theses. It's a dramatic text where the dramatic incidents are just as important for understanding what's going on as the sort of philosophical theses that sometimes find their way into Socrates' mouth as well. So here we've got a dramatic incident which is packed with philosophical meaning. Let's take a look at it. It's really significant and important, so it's worth taking a look at here. Let's read it through. So now Thrasymachus had many times started out to take over the argument in the midst of our discussion, but he had been restrained by the men sitting near him who wanted to hear the argument out. Just feel the drama here. He's so urgent he has this urge to get up, but people are restraining him. No, wait, Thrasymachus, wait your turn. But when we paused and I said this, he could no longer keep quiet. Hunched up like a wild beast, he flung himself at us as if to tear us to pieces. Then both Polemachus and I got all in a flutter from fright, and he shouted out into our midst and said, "What is this nonsense that has possessed you for so long, Socrates? And why do you act like fools, making way for one another? If you truly want to know what the just is, don't only ask and gratify your love of honor by refuting what someone answers. You know that it is easier to ask than to answer, but answer yourself and say what you assert the just to be. And see to it that you don't tell me that it is the needful or the helpful or the profitable or the gainful or the advantageous. But tell me clearly and precisely what you mean, for I won't accept it if you say such inanities." Right. I was astounded. So this is Socrates' response now. I was astounded when I heard him, and looking at him I was frightened. I think that if I had not seen him before he saw me, I would have been speechless. As it was, just when he began to be exasperated by the argument, I had looked at him first so that I was able to answer him, and with just a trace of tremor I said, Thrasymachus, don't be hard on us. If we are making any mistake in the consideration of the arguments, Polemachus and I know well that we're making an unwilling mistake. If we're searching for gold, we would never willingly make way for one another in the search and ruin our chance of finding it. So don't suppose that when we are seeking for justice, a thing more precious than a great deal of gold, we would ever foolishly give in to one another and not be as serious as we can be in bringing it to light. Don't you suppose that, my friend? Rather, as I suppose, we are not competent. So it's surely far more fitting for us to be pitied by you clever men than to be treated harshly, right? So Thrasymachus is portrayed here as a wild, very theatrically as a wild beast. He sort of flings himself into the discussion. Looks like he's going to tear the other participants to pieces, right? So Thrasymachus' way of arguing, his way of entering into speech, his way of convincing is all on display here, right? That for Thrasymachus, argument is a performance. It's a way of drawing attention to yourself and the sort of the lucidity, the brilliance of your arguments, right? So what Polemachus is kind of, what Thrasymachus is kind of frustrated about, it's this. He says, why do you keep giving way to each other, right? What he's frustrated with is this style of argument of Socrates where he's in this conversation with Polemachus where they're working together, they're collaborating, they're correcting one another, they're looking for a common perspective that unifies and improves the perspectives they both bring to the table, right? So he's looking for a point of kind of common agreement on truth. And for Thrasymachus, this is nonsense, right? That argument is about proving yourself superior to somebody else. Argument is agonistic. It's a struggle, and it's about proving superior, right? And Socrates' response kind of reflects this, right? The response to that kind of performance is fear and not engagement, right? It's kind of it's a sort of drawing back, and it's kind of Socrates is being deliberately kind of dramatic here. He's not, I don't think we're intended to take his fear seriously, but it's dramatizing that contrast in styles of arguments, right? And that is supremely important, because from these styles of argument, Socrates and Plato in this book are going to build out different types of political arrangement, and different types of sort of political regime stem out of these differences in arguments and out of these differences in approach, right? The one is looking for commonality, agreement among different participants, and the other one is a competition where it's about performance and it's about winning, and that these two are incompatible. And of course, what's ultimately reflected in them for Socrates and Plato is the difference between what the sophists do, Thrasymachus being a famous sophist, and what the philosophers do in contrast. So Thrasymachus was a sophist and seemed to have been fairly well known. There's a couple of works at the time that are attributed to him by some authors, and some people sort of dispute that and say maybe it's sort of different characters called Thrasymachus and living at the time, but certainly he seems to have sort of had a reputation as a teacher of rhetoric and a sophist, and wrote speeches for wealthy clients. So for Thrasymachus, debating is about winning, and winning allows one to accumulate wealth and power. So think about the sophists in relation to the Athenian democracy that we talked about in the introduction lecture, right? That in the new democracy, the important sort of the important platform for winning success, for winning influence, is the democratic forum. And in order to be persuasive in the democratic forum, what you had to do was give influential speeches, right? So the sophists are a kind of ancient political consultant who claimed that they had this expertise in rhetoric, this expertise in language, that they would teach people how to give speeches, and of course they charge money for their expertise. And in contrast with that expertise, wealthy citizens would be able to win influence, would be able to win clients, and would be able to win a lot of power for their ideas and their way of doing things. So this is what Thrasymachus is sort of what he represents, and for Plato, what the sophists represent is this idea of debating in order to win influence and power in the democratic assembly, but doing it in a way that's using these sort of skills and techniques of rhetoric in order to win people over. So it's not about truth and agreement. It's about things like performance and winning influence and power through successful performance. Okay, all of this is reflected in Thrasymachus's definition of justice, which seems a bit strange at first until we sort of dig into what it means and what it's saying. The official sort of definition that he gives to Socrates, he says, Socrates, this is what justice means. Justice is the advantage of the stronger. Right? And simply what he means by that is very simply that the people in power in any state, whether it's a monarchy, whether it's an aristocracy, whether it's a democracy, whether it's an oligarchy, whoever is in power in a state, those rulers get to define what justice is. And what they do is they define it in their own interests, and they call that justice. And everybody else has to go along with it, right? So there's no justice that is in, there's no idea of justice for Thrasymachus that is in everybody's interest, that is a common interest. There is just a definition of justice that is in the advantage of the people with power, the people with rule, the people who rule, and those people impose that definition on everybody else, right? So justice is something invented by rulers for their own advantage, for their own needs, in order to get everybody else to do what they want. So justice reflects the advantage of the stronger being the rulers and the powerful. Here's what he says in the relevant passage. This is Thrasymachus speaking. He says, don't you know that some cities are ruled tyrannically, some democratically, some aristocratically? Of course. In each city isn't the ruling group master? Certainly. And each ruling group sets down laws for its own advantage. A democracy sets down democratic laws, and tyranny tyrannic laws, and the others do the same. And they declare that what they have set down, their own advantage, is just for the ruled, and the man who departs from it they punish as a breaker of the law and a doer of unjust deeds. This, best of men, is what I mean. In every city the same thing is just, the advantage of the established ruling body. It surely is master. So the man who reasons rightly concludes that everywhere justice is the same thing, the advantage of the stronger. Right? And of course, Thrasymachus is a sophist, is the person who allows this individual or this group of individuals with power to exercise it in their own interest and to convince the ruling group that they're doing it in the interest of the whole city. There's a really important distinction here between justice as physis, which is the ancient Greek word for nature, or justice as nomos, the word for convention or law. So Thrasymachus is taking the view that justice is nomos, justice is conventional law, meaning that justice doesn't exist in nature. It's invented when people in power say, this is justice, this is how people should behave, but of course that simply reflects their own interests. So what Socrates is going to have to show against that view, and again, this sort of idea of justice as nomos, that it's simply what the ruling group says it is a very cynical idea of justice, in the sense that it presents justice as a kind of a con, as a kind of a strategy to manipulate the masses of people. And of course, that's the metaphor that Thrasymachus uses in the text. He talks of the sheep and the shepherd as the kind of the relation that we need to understand ruler and ruled, right? So the ruler is the shepherd who manipulates the ruled in order to get them to do what the ruler wants, in order to serve the ruler's interests, right? The ruler wants the sheep to be fat and to be full of to be able to be sold as meat and wool, and they're sort of cultivated for that interest. And Thrasymachus' sort of cynical view of political life suggests that that's what's at stake there as well, that this is what happens in the relation between ruler and ruled. So in order to criticize that, Plato and Socrates are going to have to think about and come up with an understanding of justice as physis or nature, as a kind of alternative view that presents justice as something that is part of human nature, right? As something that extends and develops and progresses the sort of intrinsic goods of human nature, right? That's very different to the sort of nomos view. According to the nomos view, there's no kind of in human nature, what we want is simply to get the better of other people, and to rule over them, right? We want to get what we want, but we don't want to have to sort of pay the penalty of other people finding out that we've been unjust, right? So the perfect thing for us is for us to be as unjust as we can and get away with it, right? None of us really want to be just. And that's the argument that again, Thrasymachus develops here in this chapter, that justice is kind of imposed. It's a convention. It's not part of who we are as human beings. Our nature is to sort of be unjust, in the sense that we are sort of we are going against the sort of common rules, and we're looking out for ourselves. So as we saw, as we talked about, he compares the relation between ruler and ruled to shepherd and sheep, and he also makes clear in this interesting passage that he's not interested in kind of petty injustices, right? So it's not people that sort of break the rules and climb over the subway turnstiles. Not that there was subways in ancient Athens, but those kind of petty crimes are not things that he's interested in. He's interested in perfect injustice, right? So it's the kind of perfect, the kind of great injustice that can be done by the ruler who holds power, not the petty injustices that can be done by sort of petty lawbreakers, right? So the difference between big crimes and little crimes, right? And when you do big crimes, you actually can you can make the law so that those things are not crimes at all, right? So with big crimes, you could sort of get away and disguise the fact that they're crimes in a way that you can't with little crimes. So he says, but when someone, in addition to the money of the citizens, kidnaps and enslaves them too, instead of these shameful names, he gets called happy and blessed, not only by the citizens, but also by whomever else hears that he has done injustice entire. For it is not because they fear doing unjust deeds, but because they fear suffering them, that those who blame injustice do so, right? That's the central point, that it's not that we don't want to do unjust deeds that we sort of come up with justice, but because we don't want to suffer injustice, at the hands of other people. That's why we agree to this sort of second best idea of justice, right? We agree not to do harm to others because they agree not to do harm to us. But ultimately, that's not what we want. What we want is to be able to get away with doing injustice to others, and for them to not to be able to do injustice to us because we're too powerful, right? That's Thrasymachus' cynical view of what human nature is like. All right, so to continue, so Socrates, this is Thrasymachus, injustice, when it comes into being on a sufficient scale, is mightier, freer, and more masterful than justice. And as I have said from the beginning, the just is the advantage of the stronger, and the unjust is what is profitable and advantageous for oneself. Right? So when justice is done on a sufficient scale, it's for Thrasymachus, it's the same thing as perfect injustice, right? Because it's being able to get away with everything you want to get away with yourself by defining what's legal and what's not, right? And it means other people can't touch and get away with doing injustice to you because the law's on your side, right? So it's this perfect injustice that allows you to do whatever you like. And Thrasymachus equates it to tyranny, and as we'll see, that becomes the big contrast of political regimes at the end of the book, between tyranny or Socrates' sort of preferred regime in the Republic, and all of that is presaged here and sort of foreshadowed in this idea of the sort of perfect tyrant that Thrasymachus is developing. Now on page 29, after Socrates has sort of talked about this argument of the arts and doctors and horse trainers and so on, he reveals that Thrasymachus is committed to two contradictory things, and that's why Thrasymachus blushes at this moment. So he's been committed to this idea that justice is a way of misleading, subduing, and dominating others for one's own profit, right? And that's why he describes it as the superior way of being. It's like being the perfect cut purse, the perfect thief that you can get away with whatever you want. So you're not a kind of petty thief. You're the kind of perfect. You have perfect power to sort of take whatever you want. But at the same time, Thrasymachus has described it as a kind of knowledge, skill, and expertise that can be taught, right? So it's not just a kind of a form of dominating and a form of controlling. It's a form of expertise that can be taught. Now, the reason that's important for Thrasymachus is obviously because he's a sophist who makes money teaching this expertise. If he wants to maintain that idea that he has a kind of expertise that can be taught, that he has a kind of expert knowledge that people ought to pay for, then he has to maintain that justice is like that it's an expertise. But that's very different to saying it's simply a way of cheating and misleading people. And Socrates sort of really sort of gets focused on this difference when he's criticizing Thrasymachus, and he makes clear that if you have a knowledge or an expertise, whether you're a doctor, whether you're a veterinarian, and whatever your expertise is in, that you share that expertise with other people, right? And those other people are they're your kind of your comrades, your sort of community, your group, and you don't get the better of that group because you all share the same expertise, right? So expertise is kind of a shared thing. It's kind of a common good shared among a community, and that conflicts with Thrasymachus's view of this idea of justice as being a perfect tyrant, which he's sort of used to persuade wealthy people that they need his expertise. So Socrates is simply highlighting the contrast between these two things, and that's why Thrasymachus blushes. He can't give up this idea that knowledge is a skill or expertise, and he can't give up this idea that it's a kind of tyranny, but he recognizes the contradiction, and and he's sort of embarrassed in that moment, but there's still a kind of unsatisfactory nature about this. He hasn't really been refuted. It's kind of a weak technical argument, and so we feel it's kind of unsatisfactory. So let's sort of go through Thrasymachus' argument about injustice here. He says on page 30. So let's go over Socrates' response to Thrasymachus here. He says, "But gratify me this much more and tell me, do you believe that either a city or an army or a pirates or robbers or any other tribe which has some common unjust enterprise would be able to accomplish anything if its members acted unjustly?" "Surely not," he said. "And what if they didn't act unjustly? Wouldn't they be more able to accomplish something?" "Certainly," he said. "For surely, Thrasymachus, it's injustice that produces factions, hatreds and quarrels amongst themselves, and justice that produces unanimity and friendship. Isn't it so?" And Thrasymachus says, "Yes, let me agree, just so that I don't have to, carry this silly argument with you anymore." And Socrates concludes, "And it's good of you to do so, best of men. Now tell me this, if it's the work of injustice, wherever it is, to implant hatred, then when injustice comes into being among freemen and slaves, would it also not cause them to hate one another and form factions?" Right. So that's sort of drawing out the argument about Thrasymachus' idea of injustice, that it causes division and faction, but in fact justice is this sort of common this common thing that unites and brings together, and sort of unites a community in a kind of knowledge or expertise. So he's drawing out the consequences of that contrast. So something we're going to have to think about increasingly when we're working through the text is whose ideas are these, Plato's or Socrates? And we have to bear in mind when reading the Republic, we're not looking primarily for facts and information. We are trying to understand the meaning of what Plato is saying about justice. So to do that, we have to interpret the text, right? The meaning isn't staring us in the face. It's not going to give us facts. It's giving us a narrative, a story, a dialogue that we have to reconstruct and we have to interpret and we have to make sense of, right? And that's especially true here, where we're dealing with an author who doesn't speak in his own voice. He speaks in the voice of a character called Socrates, who, yes, was a real person, but in this text, right, he's a character created by Plato, and Plato puts these words into Socrates' mouth. So we have to ask questions about what Plato is saying, why he's putting these words into Socrates, and what meaning Plato wants to convey by doing that, right? What meaning does he want to convey by making Socrates say these things? So that's where we're going to have to go. That's what we're going to have to think about to interpret the text. It's a work that we have to do of reconstruction, of interpreting, of putting the things together, of finding out how things fit together, so we can sort of work out fully what Plato wants us to take from this book. Okay, finally some conclusions for book 1. So we saw that Socrates embarrasses Thrasymachus, he blushes, but he doesn't really deal with his challenge to justice, and that will be apparent when we start book 2. And the challenge that Thrasymachus poses, the challenge of the sophists to philosophy, that will be restated once we start book 2, and it will take us the entirety of the book to fully respond to that challenge. So we saw Thrasymachus was a sophist, and we saw the sort of theatricality of how Plato presents him in this book, and we saw his perspective provides a powerful challenge to philosophy in its view of its kind of conventional view of justice, which I said was quite a cynical view of justice, that it's not natural to us, it's not part of what we naturally want, of our natural self-interested nature. So we'll have to look at that and see how Socrates and Plato launch a response to that view. We've also seen, finally, the important themes of justice, power, tradition, community, and expertise, knowledge emerge in the first book. And we'll see that those things continue to be important, with the partial exception of tradition, which in the form of Cephalus has been sort of sidelined here. But we'll see how justice, how it relates to power, how it relates to community, and the important role of expertise and knowledge, we'll see keep being developed throughout the book.